All right, thank you all for coming. I'm going to kill the music. Thank you for coming. This is a full house. This is exciting. We are thrilled to have Drew Hines with us. How many of you know who he is? I had a hunch we'd have a few people that are familiar with Drew. He has earned his reputation, hasn't he? Drew is a retired pastor, Washington Baptist Church in Greer. Where did you start, though? Your first church?
Ebenezer Welcome.
Ebenezer Welcome.
Yeah.
Graduate of University of Southern Carolina, but also South Carolina, but also Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so a pastor for over 40 years. That makes him a man dear to my heart. My father is a pastor. He's now approaching 90 years old. So I grew up in a pastor's home in a very small rural farming community, although that was in Idaho, a little different than here, but I appreciate the ministry of a lifetime devoted to God and His Word and His people. So, but that's not what he's here to talk about today. He has been a friend of Dean Campbell, and Dean probably played some influence in pushing him this way, but ended up pouring time into studying the dark corner that this exhibit here is about. So he has written a book on the history of Washington Baptist Church, but now he has written a book called North of Jordan. And so I was a little confused as an outsider from Idaho. The Jordan is in Israel, and north of Jordan is the Sea of Galilee. So I wondered why he was writing a book on the Sea of Galilee. But no, this is Jordan Road that really becomes the end dividing line, edge of the dark corner. And so talking about the people, the culture, the history, the traditions north of the dark corner. So that's our topic today. However, I think it's going to be on a new book, and it is coming out. Do you have a title?
Hidden History of the Dark Corner.
Okay, tell us, when you get up, tell us whatever you want us to know about that. But that will be coming out probably in March. And we'll have Drew back when his new book is out so that we can hear more about that. So thank you for coming. We're glad to have you, and welcome, Drew Hines.
Thank you, David. Well, as the old fella said, before I speak, I'd like to say something. And what I'd like to say, first of all, is thank you so much to David and to Jonathan Lovegrove and to all the staff here at the Greer Heritage Museum for initiating this event and bringing us together today. And I also want to say a big thank you to each and every morning to learn a little more maybe about local history. And I hope that that's going to be accomplished during our time together. You know, earlier this week, last Thursday, I was speaking to a group on a similar topic that I'm speaking on today down in Edgefield County. And I told them, I said, I feel woefully unqualified to come down here to Edgefield County to talk about history. Because with the possible exception of Charleston, there's no part of the state of South Carolina with greater historical significance than Edgefield County, South Carolina. The birthplace of 10 South Carolina governors, the home of 5 lieutenant governors, the home of 7 United States senators, one of the seedbeds of secessionism in the state of South Carolina. So I felt, I was about history. But then as I thought about it, I thought, well, South Carolina is such a small state and such an old state, colonized centuries ago, that there's hardly an inch of real estate in South Carolina that's not historically significant in some way. And that is certainly the case with the upper part of South Carolina, this beautiful part of the world that we call home. Because you see, most credible historians, going all the way back to the American Revolution, most credible historians will tell you that the American Revolution was won in the backcountry of South Carolina. And some of you are aware of that, but when we were educated in school on the history of the American Revolution, Most of us learned more about Bunker Hill and Monmouth and Valley Forge and Paul Revere, Kings Mountain. I want to tell you, folks, this is where the war was won, in this area right here. I think about it a lot. You know, Sir Henry Clinton, who was the commander of the British forces in America at that time, as the American Revolution was dragging along, decided that the strategy to win America would be to initiate a Southern campaign, to send Lord Cornwallis to Charleston, to take Charleston, and then come into the back country and win for the Loyalists in the back country of South Carolina, North Carolina, move up into Virginia, meet the Northern troops, and then put a stranglehold on patriotism in America. It's a great plan, but it didn't work. They ran into the Scots-Irish, and the Scots-Irish schooled them on war. Now, they won an important victory in Camden. Right after that, the dominoes began to fall for the British. Major Patrick Ferguson, who was one of Cornwallis's leading commanders, made the mistake of sending a message to the over-the-mountain men in Tennessee. And he said, if you don't put your lot in for the King of England, I'm going to come across the mountain to your homes and we're going to kill your wives and children. Well, what he didn't take into account was that those people in Tennessee, western North Carolina, and western South Carolina had been fighting Indians for years. So the British were just a drop in the bucket to them. And so right after that, the Patriot cause was galvanized here in the western part of South Carolina. In August of 1780, the Battle of Musgrove Mill was won. Then those over-the-mountain men came to Kings Mountain and met Major Patrick Ferguson and defeated Ferguson, killed him as a matter of fact, and defiled his body. I won't say any more about that, but insulted him and the Loyalist cause, and Kings Mountain was won. Then the Battle of Blackstock on November 20th, 1780. Then Daniel Morgan taught the British a thing or two at the Battle of Cowpens in January of 1781. And then his lordship, Lord Cornwallis, decided that he was going to hightail it to Virginia, and he met Nathaniel Greene in Greensboro at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. That was a Pyrrhic victory for the British. They won the battle, but they lost the war. So this is the history of our area. This is who we are. And this morning, I want to emphasize the fact that you are living in the midst of history. You don't have to go to Charleston. You don't have to go to Edgefield to find places of great historical significance. Here in the upstate, the Dark Corner, and by the way, I appreciate David mentioning my book coming out in March. It's entitled Hidden History of the Dark Corner. It's being published by the History Press in Charleston, and they assure me that it's going to be available March the 18th. You can pre-order it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble right now, but it'll make its appearance March the 18th, and I'm excited about that, and I hope to be back in the spring to talk a little bit about the Dark Corner. I'm in no way the leading living expert on the Dark Corner, but I was fortunate enough to know the men who were. I first met Dr. Jim Howard back in 1982. And then Dean Campbell was a dear friend of mine. As a matter of fact, he wrote the foreword to North of Jordan for me. It was the last thing he wrote before he died. He wrote the foreword, and I had the honor of conducting his memorial service a year ago this month. So these were the men. And Man Batson, the great historian of Upper Greenville County, was a mentor and a dear friend of mine. And these were the men I learned under. And I learned a little something about the Dark Corner from them. And I'm very grateful to them for that. Now, if you have an interest in reading more about the history of importance, beginning with this one right here. If you have an interest in colonial and revolutionary history of our area, this book here was written in 1897. The Colonial and Revolutionary History of Upper South Carolina, written by Dr. J.B.O., John Belton O'Neill Landrum. He was a physician in Spartanburg County. He was the son of the great Baptist preacher Reverend John Gill Landrum, for whom the town of Landrum is named. And he was named after John Belton O'Neill, who was a prominent judge and politician in South Carolina. By the way, he had a summer home just up the road, up Highway 101. They named the community after him. O'Neill was named after him. But this book was written in 1897, and Dr. Landrum, like me, he was not a historian. I don't claim to be a historian. But he had the good fortune of living during a time when he, as a young man, had met the children and the grandchildren of Revolutionary War veterans who gave him accounts of what happened at these various battles that took place in the upstate of South Carolina. You need to get to know. And then, of course, the Bible of the Dark Corner. Dark Corner Heritage by Dr. Jim Howard. Dr. Jim Howard was a retired Baptist minister from the Highland community. And when he retired from the ministry, he and his wife Ruth moved back to Highland, and he wrote this book in 1980. And he was assisted by, and this book has been reprinted. I understand, David, I don't know, do you have copies of this book for sale here?
Not yet.
Okay.
Will very soon.
All right, I hope so. That's a book you need to know. Another one is a book by Anne McEwen called Including a Pile of Rocks. Don't you love that title? Anne of Glassy Mountain. And this is a very well-researched book chronicling the history of the Centers and other family members who lived on and around Glassy Mountain. So this is a book that you might enjoy, especially if you're connected to those families. This book was written by my friend Man Batson, A History of the Upper Part of Greenville County, South Carolina. He called this the big boy because he wrote other books. He wrote about the grist mills of this county, of this area. He wrote about the state road, great books about the state road. And this book is basically, he chronicles newspaper reports, magazine articles about historical events that took place in this area. Another good book was written by James Lawrence, who was at one time the publisher of the Landrum Leader, and it's called Indians, Bloodshed, Tears, Churches, and Schools. It all started at Fort Gowan. And this book is about the history of Gowan's Fort that I'm going to be talking about in just a minute. And he has a lot of neat and interesting stories in here. As a matter of fact, and being a Baptist minister, I don't know anything about this. Some of you may be familiar with a man named Jack Daniels. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but Jack Daniels had a very popular recipe for whiskey. Jack Daniels, and I didn't realize this, his family originated up around Gowensville, moved to Tennessee, and started making whiskey. The old number 9, is that what they call it? Somebody told me about that. But the recipe for the old number 9 actually came from Gowensville. Did you know that? And then, of course, our friend Dean Stewart Campbell wrote a beautiful book with wonderful photographs in it about the Dark Corner called Unto the Hills. I believe that, Jonathan, you've got some available. As many of you know, wrote a column for the Tryon Daily Bulletin for years called Twice Told Tales of the Dark Corner. And after Dean's passing, I started writing, not that column, but another column for the Tryon Daily Bulletin called Across the Mountain that appears every at the first of every month in the Tryon Daily Bulletin. But Dean actually has, and these are available back here, the Twice Told Tales of the Dark Corner. There are 2 volumes. So these are just a few of the books that you might be interested in if you'd like to study further the history of the Dark Corner or of the upper part of Greenville and Spartanburg County, South Carolina. Now, I want to begin by talking a little bit about our Revolutionary history here in the upper part, particularly in the Dark Corner. It's an amazing history. You realize before the American Revolution, the Scots-Irish settled this area en masse. Now, many of us, if not most of us, are descended from the Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish were an interesting people. They were originally residents of the border country between England and Scotland. And the English and the Scots fought each other all the time. They had war time. They were tough people. They were unrelenting people. And so when the King of England in the late 17th century began having some problems with the Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland, he said, well, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to colonize Northern Ireland, and I'm going to send the meanest, roughest people I can find to Northern Ireland to put down these revolts and to keep the peace in Northern Ireland. So what did he do? He went to the northern part of England, the southern part of Scotland, and gathered these people and offered them land in Northern Ireland around Belfast and Ulster. And they went and they served their purpose. They colonized Northern Ireland. But then around 1740, one of the first potato famines struck Ireland. And so these people went to America. William Penn, who was the governor of Pennsylvania, recognized the value of these people because, you see, William Penn was a Quaker. They didn't fight. They lived in Philadelphia. But in the western part of Pennsylvania were marauding Indians, and they knew it was only a matter of time before these Indians started giving them problems. So what they did is they began bringing the Scots-Irish into western Pennsylvania, giving them land in western Pennsylvania to act as a buffer between the Quakers in Philadelphia and the Indians in western Pennsylvania. And it worked for a while. But the Indians, who were being inflamed by the British, got too rough for the Scots-Irish. And so they began to migrate again, Virginia and into the Carolinas. So most of us who have Scots-Irish heritage, our ancestors did not come into this country from Charleston, but came down from Pennsylvania and settled in the western part of South Carolina and North Carolina. So they came here, and once again, they discovered there were problems with the Indians. What are we going to do? Well, Governor Glenn of South Carolina in 1755 had signed a treaty with the Cherokee. And the boundary line between the white settlements and the Cherokee territory was the Greenville-Spartanburg County line as we know it today. If you crossed over into Greenville County, you took your life into your own hands. You were fairly safe in Spartanburg County. But what happened is because of a number of Indian raids, a string of frontier forts were constructed in this area beginning in the 1760s. Fort Prince was constructed down around modern-day Welford. And then you had Earl's Fort up close to the North Carolina line. Then you had Woods Fort near modern-day Appalachia. As a matter of fact, and I am not an expert on this either, but I happen to believe that Woods Fort was located on the site of the modern-day Appalachia Baptist Church. That's a promontory point there, and usually when forts were constructed in those days, they'd put them on high spots, high places, so they'd be able to see anyone who was coming to attack them. So you had Woods Fort, and then you had Gowan's Fort, Fort Gowan. I want to talk a little bit about Gowan's Fort. Gowan's Fort was built around 1760, around 1760, 1762, as a fortress against Indian attack. It was built on the old Blackstock Road. Now, the Blackstock Road was an important colonial thoroughfare that ran all the way from 96. Now, 96 was a British outpost. As you know, it was the upcountry British outpost. And this road ran from 96 all the way to the blockhouse in Tryon. The blockhouse in Tryon, but it went all the way to the blockhouse. And by the way, the Cherokee boundary began at the blockhouse. So Blackstock Road ran to the blockhouse in Tryon. And if you want to know where South Blackstock Road is today, where the fort was located, go up Highway 14. And when you come to Fairview Baptist Church on the right, that's South Blackstock Road. Take a right on South Blackstock Road and go about a mile or so, and on the right there's a clearing behind the home of Mr. Buddy Williams, the master beekeeper of South Blackstock Road that I talk about in this book. And the location of Fort Gowan is behind his house on his land. He doesn't mind people knowing about it. He just doesn't want people traipsing across his property to try to find relics and artifacts. But that's where it was. Now, portions of Blackstock Road can still be found today. Over, of course, as you know, right beside Westgate Mall in Spartanburg is a portion of the Blackstock Road. South Blackstock Road is where the old Gowan's Fort was located. Now, interestingly enough, during the American Revolution, Gowan's Fort changed hands 5 times between the Patriots and the British. 5 times. First of all, it started out as a fort against the Indians before the Revolution. One humorous story about Gowan's Fort is this. Back in those days, the settlers who were settled in the region, in the area, whenever there was danger of an Indian attack, they would flee to the fort. That was a common practice for the settlers. They'd go to the fort and they'd take their livestock with them so the Indians couldn't get their livestock. Well, the story is told of a man, one of the early settlers in the edge of the woods, a Cherokee warrior. The Cherokee brave didn't see him. So he raised his flintlock rifle and he took aim and he fired and he missed him. Well, as you know, it took a while to reload those rifles and he knew he didn't have time. So he started running for Gowan's Fort with all of his might. And he heard footsteps behind him. And he just knew that Cherokee warrior was behind the gates of the fort. And he noticed everybody was laughing at him. And he finally turned around to see if the Indian was behind him, and it was a black bull behind him. The bull had been conditioned whenever it heard a gunshot to run to the fort. And it was the black bull that was trying to get to the fort, and the guy, he thought it was the Indian right behind him. And so every man, and we don't know what his name was, and he's probably glad we don't. But there was the story of the Black Sentinel of Gowan's Fort. But Gowan's Fort also had a bloody history as well. As I said, it changed hands 5 times during the war. One notable occurrence that happened at Gowan's Fort happened in July of 1780. It was right after the first battle of Cedar Springs, which took place in Spartanburg County, July 12th, 1780. Well, it was a Patriot victory, and the Loyalists fled the area. And at that time, Gowan's Fort was under the possession of the Loyalists. And so they came to Gowan's Fort, and they took refuge in Gowan's Fort. Well, Colonel John Jones from North Carolina, who led the Burke County Militia, had just been down in Augusta. And he was on his way to Rutherfordton. And he heard that there were some Loyalists in Gowan's Fort, and he was coming up Blackstock Road because, you know, it was I-85 back then. And so he came up with a strategy. Since they were in their militia outfits, they didn't have the continental uniforms. And so he said to his men, there were about 30 of them. He said, what we're going to do is we're going to pretend and gain their confidence. And then when I give a signal, we'll take them. So that's what happened. They got there about 11 o'clock on the night of July the 13th, 1780. They came in and told the Loyalists inside, and of course the Loyalists were the ones who were loyal to King George. You know that. They were loyal to the British. And so they told the Loyalists that they too fought. The men roused their wives to make a meal for these guests. And after the men had eaten and after they had rested, Colonel Jones gave the signal and they took Fort Gowan. I think there was one fatality. And so Gowan's Fort was taken back for the Patriot cause. A little later after that, Colonel Jones was badly wounded at Earl's Fort. But anyway, that was one notable incident that took place at Gowan's Fort. There's another one I want to mention too, much bloodier, much more tragic. Bloody Bill Bates. How many of you ever heard of Bloody Bill Bates? All right, Bloody Bill Bates was a Loyalist. But as you could tell by his name, he wouldn't have won the Miss Congeniality. He was bloodthirsty. He was a desperado. And he was more interested really in loot than loyalty to King George, because he was given permission by the British to raid the Patriots, to take all kinds of liberties with the Patriots, and he did. He killed dozens, if not hundreds, of Patriots in this area. He and his men back mountain. They had a lair there. They were also surrounded by a group of Chickamauga Indians. Now, the Chickamauga Indians were Cherokee, who were especially hostile toward white people. They wanted to kill every white person who had come into this area to settle. They were led by Canoe. Dragging Canoe was the chief. He was a radicalized Cherokee. And he led untold raids against white settlers in North Carolina and Tennessee. As a matter of fact, I had an ancestor who was tomahawked and scalped by a war party from Dragging Canoe in Sevier County, Tennessee, in about 1783. In fact, if you go there to that cemetery today, as I have many times, on the tombstone, it gives his name and it says killed and scalped by the Indians. And that was one of Dragging Canoe's raiding parties. And so anyway, these Chickamauga Indians were with Bloody Bill Bates, and they took every opportunity to kill white settlers that they could. Well, Bloody Bill Bates heard that there was a group of patriots in Gowan's Fort. And so they made their raid against Gowan's Fort. They were inside Fort Gowan. Bloody Bill Bates then told the people who were occupying the fort, if you will surrender, we will give you quarter. We'll let you go. They shouldn't have believed him. They should have known. They did surrender the fort, and Bloody Bill killed women and children, scalped them. The Chickamaugas scalped the women. There was one woman who survived to old age. She was scalped, and she survived to old age. Captain Buck Gowan, for whom the fort was named, was captured, but they were later escaped because they were going to be taken to the mountains and tortured. The Indians had some particularly creative tactics for torturing the white settlers. But that's the history of Gowan's Fort. And every time I pass by, I buy bee supply, this rich history, this bloody history that took place right in this man's backyard. And you would be surprised how many locations around here these kinds of significant historical events took place. Well, as I said, after the American Revolution, more settlement took place here in the upper part of Greenville and Spartanburg County, South Carolina. The Scots-Irish, very independent people, very serious people. I love what Colonel John Sevier said. John Sevier, who was the governor of Tennessee, was of French Huguenot extraction. And he never could figure out the Scots-Irish. And he had them in his regiment. One of my ancestors, Hosea Rose, was a lieutenant in John Sevier's militia and participated in the Battle of Kings Mountain because of their very serious and very focused personalities and character. And he said they brewed like apples in a cellar. I love that. They brewed like apples in a cellar. But anyway, the Scots-Irish came into this part of the country, and they brought with them their recipe, as I mentioned earlier, as Mr. Batson used to call it. And some of the moonshine that they made in the dark corner in particular was made legally. Did you realize that a great amount of dark corner moonshine was in fact legal because the distillers were registered with the Department of Revenue? But most of it, of course, was illegal. Some of you. He was a magistrate back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He lived at the intersection of Tougaloo Road and Dill Road. He was the magistrate. As a matter of fact, I knew his granddaughter. She was a dear woman. I used to visit in his home there at the corner of Tougaloo Road, and she would tell me stories about his days as a magistrate. She told me that across the road there was a big oak tree. They'd have a trial there in the magistrate's. It was frontier justice. But the revenuers would come in on Friday nights and spend the night at John B. Dill's, and then they'd get up on Saturday morning and they'd go on their still raids into the mountains. And of course the moonshiners would find out about it, and they'd fire shots to warn each other about the approaching revenuers. But there was a booming blockade whiskey because these people discovered very early on that corn sells better by the gallon than it does the bushel. And a lot of them made a lot of money making moonshine whiskey. There was a family up there around Ebenezer Welcome Baptist Church, and they were the Crane family. The Crane family. Some of you may be related to them. And there were two boys in the family by the name of Dean, 1881. Buford was born in 1885. So we've come down the road a little bit in our history. But they were born into the home of a moonshiner and a bootlegger. They learned very early on how to make moonshine whiskey, and they did, with gusto. And not only did they make it, they drank it. But then Dean, as he grew older, became a student at the North Greenville Academy at Tiger, that he heard about the Bible, and he heard about Christ, and he heard about the salvation that was available to him. And in a revival meeting at Ebenezer Welcome Baptist Church, my first church out of seminary, as a matter of fact, the pastor at that time, who was R.B. Vaughn, who preached Vaughn, names that you may be familiar with. He was preaching a revival, and both Dean and Buford were saved, gloriously saved, and they became very serious about their faith. Both of them became Baptist ministers, and Dean became more prominent than Buford, but they both were faithful in their ministry. As a matter of fact, Dean went on to become the pastor of Pendleton Street Baptist Church in Greenville, the largest church in Greenville at that time. He became the president of the South Carolina Baptist Convention. He became the first vice president of the Southern Baptist Convention. As a matter of fact, I have heard that he either made the motion in 1925 or seconded the motion on the floor of the Southern Baptist Convention to establish what we Southern Baptists know as the cooperative program. But Dean was well respected and much loved. But nothing brought him greater pleasure than to go back up into the dark corner and to visit with his family and with his friends. There are a couple of great stories told about Dean and Buford. I don't know if they're true or not, but they're great stories. One involves Dean preaching one day at a homecoming somewhere up there, and Buford was in the audience, in the congregation. And Dean looked out, and there was a man sitting right beside Buford who had fallen asleep. And so Dean stopped his sermon and he said, "Buford, wake up that man next to you. He's fallen asleep." And Buford didn't miss a beat. He said, "You wake him up. You put him to sleep." Another wonderful story involves a meeting of the South Carolina Baptist Convention at Pendleton Street Baptist Church. Dean was the president of the South Carolina Baptist Convention at that time. And they were considering a matter on the floor that day that was very controversial, and they weren't getting anywhere. They were arguing with each other. And so Dean, who was presiding over the meeting, stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to adjourn to the social hall of the church down in the basement where the ladies of the church had prepared coffee and donuts for us." And Buford spoke up and said, "Will there be hot dogs?" And Dean said, "No, all the hot dogs are up here." I read with great interest a lady, Mrs. Westmoreland, right after the death of Dean Crane in 1955. He died January the 10th, 1955. And a lady named Mrs. Westmoreland wrote a great book. It seems that Dean Crane was a great friend of Governor Jimmy Burns. And Jimmy Burns sponsored, even though he was a Democrat, sponsored a visit by Dwight Eisenhower, who was president at that time, to come to Columbia. And Dwight Eisenhower gave a speech to the legislature and on the steps of the Capitol. Dean Crane was asked to come and pray and to give the invocation before the president spoke. The New York Times reported that as good as President Eisenhower's speech was, it couldn't match the fervency of the prayer of Reverend Dean Crane. And after the death of Dean Crane, Mrs. Crane received a personal letter from President Eisenhower talking about the wonderful prayer that he had prayed that day on the steps of this. And I could tell. I'm going to close it down right now, but I could talk for hours about the people and the history and the events of the Dark Corner. But I want to close with a story that I tell in north of Jordan. And I call it an amazing story because it is. Gownsville Baptist Church. Many of you are familiar with that church. If you try, it looks like a picture postcard. Gownsville Baptist Church, beautiful church. Home church of the Campbells and so many other families of the Dark Corner. What you may not know is that that church was founded in 1820. As a matter of fact, Dean Campbell's last book was a 200-year history of Gownsville Baptist Church. He was writing the 200-year history of the Gownsville Baptist Church. And we would often compare notes because our churches shared pastors and so forth. But anyway, the church, when it was founded, was actually about a mile west of where it is now on Old Highway 11. It was called Crossroads Baptist Church. Well, it was a thriving Baptist congregation back in the day. There was a man by the name of William Walker. How many of you are familiar with William Walker? All right, I know Ted would be familiar with William Walker. William Walker was a native of Union County, born in 1809. From a very early age, he displayed musical talent and ability. As a matter of fact, they started calling him Singing Billy Walker. And Billy Walker was a pioneer in shape note music that was prevalent back in pioneer days. And he would go around from church to church teaching the shape note method of singing, fa, sol, la. He compiled a hymnal, what some people call the first American hymnal. Certainly the most important American hymnal, historically speaking, called. He would go to churches and he'd have these singing schools, and then he would sell hymnals, Southern Harmony. Well, it just so happens that when he was compiling that hymnal, he came across an obscure poem that was written by an obscure English clergyman by the name of John Newton. John Newton, who lived back in the 1700s, many of you know his story. He was a slave trader. But one night during a storm on the sea, he was marvelously converted to Christianity, and he became an Anglican minister. And it was the practice of many ministers back in those days to write poems for their sermons. And so on New Year's Day, I can't remember what year it was, he wrote a poem that he entitled Faith's Review and Expectation. Poem and set it to music, but it faded into obscurity. William Walker came across that obscure poem, and he changed the title of the hymn to Amazing Grace. And he gave it a new, beautiful tune. And its first appearance was in Southern Harmony. He is the one who popularized the hymn, Amazing Grace. Well, let's get back to Gowensville. What has this got to do with Gowensville? Well, William Walker was conducting a singing school at Gowensville Baptist Church, Crossroads Baptist Church. And he said, you know, folks, you're running out of room here. You need a bigger building. You need to move. And the people of Gowensville said, we have no money. How are we going to do this? He said, well, it just so happens I own 5 acres of land in Gowensville. I'll give it to you. And so they moved to the spot where they are now. And when William Walker signed the deed, he signed it William Walker, A.S.H. If you see the deed today, it's on the deed. A.S.H. stands for author of Southern Harmony. And so, here we have this fascinating story of a man who popularized the most beloved hymn of all time and who generously gave the land to Gowensville Baptist Church where it sits to this day. And again, I say there's all kinds of history and tradition in our area. Get to know it. Thank you so very much. I appreciate you being here.
Do you have a couple minutes for questions?
Yeah, sure.
I'm just curious if anyone has questions from what he said. We have a couple minutes. We could entertain some questions. Do you have anything you'd like to ask?
Yes, man.
I know a lot of people over time have talked about and disputed the boundaries of Dark Corner.
Yes.
Pumpkin Town and Table Rock, is that
No.
Dark Corner?
No. Okay, that's a great question. A lot of people want to know, where is the Dark Corner? Well, as you know, if you've gone up in that community 40 or 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, and said, where's the Dark Corner? What would they tell you? It's a little further up the road. That's what they'd tell you. They didn't want to admit to living in the Dark Corner. But today, of course, everybody's proud to be from the Dark Corner, live in the Dark Corner. But the boundary of the Dark Corner is pretty much undisputed. And Dr. Howard, Dean Campbell, Man Batson would all tell you that the Dark Corner is roughly or basically the Glassy Mountain Township. Mountain, Hogback Mountain to the North Carolina line to the north. The eastern border is Spartanburg County, the Spartanburg County line. A lot of people argue with me when I tell them that Little Chicago is not in the Dark Corner. It's not, because it's in Spartanburg County. It's a world all to itself. We could write a book on Little Chicago. The western boundary of the Dark Corner is Highway 25. And this is where it gets a little fuzzy. A lot of people say Highway 414, some go as far as Jordan Road. But that's where the dark corner is. I know there's a dark corner over there around Pumpkin Town. There are dark corners all around. But that's where the dark corner is.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
Fueled the culture that we know of as Dark Corner started north, think West Virginia hillbilly mountains, and worked their way down to this area. And anywhere that you had rugged terrain, you had Scots-Irish people, you had moonshine and feuding and bloodshed, and then going all the way down into Alabama. So I think one of the important distinction points is some of the cultural anomalies of the Dark Corner were more broad spread than this geographic isolation.
Yeah.
We're not saying that there wasn't any moonshine or feuding in Pumpkin Town.
Yeah.
There certainly was. But what we're referencing when we talk about this is this specific set of people and culture and place and time.
Yeah, true. Because my mother's family is from Western North Carolina. They really are. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my grandparents, they're from Glassy Mountain.
Yes.
My grandparents, their name is Pruitt.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any history, like a book or something on Glassy Mountain?
Well, I mentioned earlier this book right here, which I don't know if y'all can get this or not, David.
We've got some on the way.
Okay, this
Yep.
is called Including a Pile of Rocks by Mrs. Ann McEwen, the late Ann McEwen. And, this is the Centers, the Plumleys. Let's see about the Pruitts. Let's see what we got here. There are Pruitts, it's spelled in different ways.
Well, let's say my grandmother was a center.
Yeah.
And I have some other families is Pruitt, is Plumleys. So I'm
The missionary who went into the dark corner, he came up to somebody and he said, "Are you a sinner?" He said, "No, I'm a Plumley." And now, this is the original spelling of Pruitt, I suppose. Prewit.
yes.
Okay.
And my grandfather, when Lassie, my family sold the land to Cliffs of Glass.
Oh, wow.
He bought it for $500 and nothing.
Yeah.
He had the whole
Dirt
stretch
cheap.
of road, another in Greer that he bought for $500.
Now,
So
in the
he
hid,
was a smart man.
yeah, in the hidden history of the dark corner, I've got an extensive history of both Glassy and Hogback, and you'll find that interesting. Yeah, you could buy it dirt cheap back in those days. Oh, wow. Yeah, there are Gosnells all over the place. Gosnells. And Glassy Mountain, I tell you what, that's quite a history right
When
there.
I was a child, I used to walk the whole Glassy Mountain every Saturday.
Yeah. And of course, at one time it was an artillery range in World War I. I've got a chapter about that in my next book. Yes.
I know moonshining was prohibited during Prohibition, but the time you're talking about was prior to Prohibition. So why were they going after the moonshiners? Was it a taxation issue?
Yeah, it was taxation. Like I said, you could legally make whiskey before Prohibition, and I guess after Prohibition. But yeah, they just refused to pay the taxes.
In an earlier draft of this exhibit, I really didn't do it. Okay, I have a chart that is the graph of the tax rate on liquor. And what you see is it varied between 5 and 10 cents a gallon from early 1700s until 1863. Confederacy went bankrupt, not legally, but practically. They had no money. And so they needed instant infusions of cash. One of the things they did was implemented a $2 a gallon tax on liquor. So if you can imagine going from 5 cents or 10 cents a gallon to $2 a gallon, the liquor itself would sell for 30 cents a gallon. So then, at the end of the Civil War, as the federal government came in, they didn't have the time to work through all of the Confederacy tax structure, so they just said, we're going to keep everything the same, not knowing that this was a bomb. So that was really, that $2 a gallon tax was the motivating factor where you were going out of business or you were making it illegally, is how they saw the choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was George Washington and Alexander Hamilton that ruined it for the moonshiners originally. These people came in here with these wonderful recipes for whiskey from their Scottish ancestors, you know, and then what they learned from their Irish neighbors. And of course, that's the center of whiskey right there. So, and then George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, we had the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. And so that was the beginning of the taxation of whiskey in America. Anybody else?
All right. Thank you all for coming. There are fresh donuts and fresh coffee in the back, and we actually have stir sticks back there now for those of you that were like, so thank you. Is there anyone here who this is your first time at the museum? Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. My little plug here would be our museum. We are not a city museum in the sense that they pay the bills. We are an independent museum. We run off of donations, and we had our best year last year ever, which was fantastic. So, and we are also entirely run by volunteers. So we have staff in the back standing around. They're all volunteers who want to diddle around with history with us. We would love to have you join us. We always have more to do than we have time to do it. There are books for sale in the back on Dark Corner, but Drew does have his books here, and he'll be over at this table on the side, and we'll be signing books. I think he said he's just going to charge $20 an autograph, I think, to sign books for you. Thank you so much for coming. Give him a round of appreciation.
Thank you. Hey, David.